Welcome to Christ and Culture. This is your host, Taylor DeSoto. Today, I wanted to cover a basic note taking method that I utilize at church when the teaching pastor is preaching, and it's been hugely beneficial to me in retention of information. It helps me review, go over my notes with my family afterwards, and so I thought I'd share. It's the method that I use when I take notes is based off of the Cornell note-taking method, and so I just wanted to review that really fast so you can kind of see where I'm coming from. So the methodology behind the Cornell note-taking method is that you have one set, you divide the paper into two sections, and one side has your notes, and then the other side has recall, and then the bottom has a summary. Now the features of a Cornell note-taking method is that you have your name on the top left. Underneath you have the subject or the lecture name. You have the date, and then if you're taking notes on a book, you can put the page number or the lecture number or the date of the lecture and things like that. So the basic concept is this: the material of the lecture goes on the right-hand side. This is a high school, college level note-taking method. You want to put on this side your main ideas. You want to probably paraphrase. You don't want to be using long sentences. If you need to use symbols or shorthand, you want to utilize that so that you can get a lot of content in a small amount of space. One of the features of the Cornell note-taking method is that on the left-hand side, you put relevant questions or keywords, and then afterwards you can take an opaque piece of paper and cover up the note side, and then you can review your notes via the keywords that you put on this side or the questions that you put on this side. And the idea is that you answer these questions with your own words, your own ideas, and then you can uncover and see if you got close to the right answer. Now, something they recommend with Cornell note-taking method is that you do short review sessions throughout the week from the time that you took the notes. So if you took the notes on a lecture or on a portion of a book on Monday, then you would maybe study for 10 minutes a day or every other day, or 10 minutes a week throughout the semester or the period of time that you're taking the course. So the goal of that is so that you're not cramming 3 or 4 months worth of material in one night before a final. The idea is that you accumulate knowledge and you build progressively on top of the material that you have. And then, of course, on the bottom, you have a summary of the lecture, kind of put some big key points on there, or maybe something that you want to reference in review later. So I've adapted the Cornell note-taking method for sermon note-taking, and I thought that this could be helpful. As you can see, it shares a slight resemblance with Cornell notes. This is where I got the inspiration for it. So the Cornell note-taking method is really where the methodology of this comes into play. As you can see, I've made slight changes and updates to the methodology for sermon note-taking. I have three rows here. You have title, the text, and the date. So the title would be the sermon title if your pastor provides that for you, or you can name it yourself. The text is the text of scripture that was the primary text for the sermon, and the date is the day the sermon was delivered. Now, the first addition that I've added to my note-taking method are a thoughts and question box, and so the idea is that you utilize all of the paper. So you can see in the Cornell note-taking method how it's more of a academically formatted. There's blank space in the header. When you're taking sermon notes, there's no one is going to be reviewing your notes. I don't know why anyone would be reviewing your notes at a college level anyway, but up here is kind of like an area that I designate before the sermon begins for any thoughts or things that I want clarified later that I can ask somebody or research myself. So as you can see, I've given myself 4 lines here, and so these questions can't be big. They can't be weighty. They've got to be paraphrased or keywords or kind of the main idea of the text or the question that I'm trying to ask. The second feature that I've changed, as you can see, I've moved the top of the partition of the paper down about 5 or 6 lines, and I've given myself room here for sermon illustrations, anecdotes, and quotes. So this is important, especially if your pastor provides a meaningful anecdote or a story that you want to hang on to, maybe a story from church history, and maybe you can, maybe something that you would want to do is, let's just say your pastor is telling the story of a pastor that preached outside by the name of George Whitefield. And so you put George Whitefield, and then you can maybe put like a key feature of the story, preached outside. And so that gives you enough information to remember what the anecdote said and maybe go and look it up in a search engine later. This is not an area to write word for word the story that he tells. Maybe he tells a story about a time when he was a child and he got lost in the mall. So you could do child lost in mall. And this will allow you to retain the kind of substance of the story and maybe ask your pastor later about that story if you want to hear it again. Oftentimes in the middle of a sermon, there's so much material being communicated that you forget some of these anecdotes that maybe you want to hang on to for later. So now this is really where I haven't deviated too much from the Cornell note-taking method. As you see, I kind of subdivided beforehand. I don't usually do this on Sunday. This kind of happens organically, and I'll show you that in a sec. But as you can see, I've made room here for an introduction, part 1, point 1, point 2, point 3, and then the application. So our teaching pastor preaches very much so in a Ramist style, and so it's very formatted. There's a lot of signposting. So this kind of structure is really easy to follow for us. You may have to adapt this to fit the way that your pastor preaches, and an easy suggestion is, maybe separate it by an introduction, and then as your pastor makes a big point, write down that big point as a header, and then write corresponding notes on this side. So that's basically the function of these notes, and it allows you to really organize the paper. So if you're in the middle of a sermon and you don't know where to write a question, you've got a box up here. If you're in the middle of the sermon and you're taking notes, but you don't want to confuse your note taking with an anecdote, you put the anecdote up here. And so that way, really, the notes that you have here are the substance of the sermon. There's not going to be a lot of convolution within your note taking here. And then finally, I've left a small space, and you can make this either bigger or smaller depending on how your pastor preaches. But once you've listened to the sermon and you review your notes, you can move some takeaways, or maybe even in the middle of the sermon, there's a big takeaway that you don't feel you want to lose in the middle of your notes. Maybe it's something you want to hang on to after, and so you can put it down here. So now that I've kind of gone over the methodology, let's go ahead and review some of my notes from this year. So this note-taking method has definitely evolved. I've kind of been developing it over the last year and a half. But as you can see, I have my format: title, text, date. And then I have kind of a big takeaway here. And so you can see that there's various ways you can use the paper. You don't necessarily need to stick to this format that I've given initially. If maybe your pastor doesn't give a lot of sermon illustrations, maybe you designate this space for another area. Or maybe you're just ahead of the curve and you don't have a lot of questions to ask, and so you can maybe designate this section for something else. So as you can see, I have up here, in this sermon, there weren't a lot of anecdotes, but there was some context of the main passage that I didn't want to put in the main section. So the context itself finds its way at the top of this outline, and so it really flows from top to bottom as though I was taking notes from a textbook. Now on the left here, you can see I've provided 3 takeaways here, or 4 takeaways actually, 4 takeaways, and I've subdivided them into 1.1, 1.2, 2.1, and 3. Not sure why I did that. That seems like a kind of funny numbering system, but hey, I don't know what I was thinking back then. And down here, I've got my takeaways. And as you can see, there's a lot of unutilized space up here and in here. And so let's maybe take a look at a sermon. Here we go. This is a fun one. So this is kind of the same sort of structure as the last one, but as you can see, I'm utilizing a lot more space on the left here. So I'm utilizing, maybe I wanted to write I think I saw it in here, a word in Greek maybe. Oh, guess this isn't the right one. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so here's a good example. So you have the header here, benediction, and then I have a scripture reference that he provided that I didn't want to put in here. And then I provided a one-line summary of the takeaway of that scripture reference, so I know why he referenced that scripture there. And then I had a lot of space. So under this benediction heading, I had this many notes. And so I utilized some of this space to kind of pull out maybe a tertiary application or a secondary application from the sermon. And then under point 2, and as you can see, I've subdivided with this line so I can organize my thoughts from point to point. And then I have subdivisions of main takeaways from here too. So utilizing the space can be more than in the Cornell note-taking system. You're just providing keywords or questions to answer to help you study. But I've added the functionality of providing a little bit more information on this side that maybe doesn't belong in the notes, that provides you more of a structure for the actual thought, which is very common for pastors that kind of wander at times in their preaching. So if your pastor makes maybe a secondary application, you can put it underneath the header here and maybe return to that later. So that's been it. That's my note-taking method. I hope it's been helpful, but really I've discovered that with this note-taking method, you can really get all the content that your pastor says by using, of course, the same methodology as Cornell, by using paraphrasing and symbols and not writing a full thought, but rather the high-level understanding of the thought. So, for example, this right here was a whole, probably like a 5-minute sermon application, and the application of that whole thought was, we inherit faith in our father Abraham. And underneath that, there's a you can tie it to over here. See, I'm making sense of my notes from earlier this month or last month. He talked about the proto-evangelium, which is Genesis 3:15, the first gospel, and I can tie it back to this thought right here. I can tie it to every single thought in here, so it makes sense. All right, I'll stop blabbering. I've been about 13 minutes. Hopefully this has been helpful. Let me just present the Cornell method next to my addition to the Cornell method. As you can see, it's a little bit similar, it's a little bit different, but hopefully this helps you guys keep track during your sermons when you're taking notes, and I hope that's helpful. All right, may the Lord bless you and keep you. This has been Taylor DeSoto with Christ and Culture. We'll see you next time.